All right, let's get into this. Alex Rienzie, you're on Singletrack. Thank you so much for joining the show. We've got a lot to talk about, and it's going to be very interesting. So, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for taking the time to talk about Michelino's record.
Yes, Michelino, Sinceri, Randa Granti, Teton, FKT, a few weeks ago now. Was widely reported was an incredible feat, and then the explosion happened and everything went sideways. Quickly give us your connection to that FKT so we kind of know from what angle you're talking.
Yeah, so I was up there as a witness and taking some photographs, myself and Connor Bergsmith. I've known Michelino since I think the summer of 2022. First time I met him was on a group trail run over in Teton Valley. He ran this thing called Mountain Ninjas for a while. I think he still runs it. I think they might have changed the name. That was the summer that I first got into outdoor climbing and trail running. And I was super slow. I'm still super slow. And he was the nicest guy in the world for hanging in the back of the pack with me and pacing when I know he could have probably run. We were running in 25% of the time that we ran it. I've known Michelino since then. I moved to Jackson back in 2020 during the pandemic. Before then, I was living in New York, working as an investment banker, a reformed lawyer before that. The pandemic gave me the excuse to move out to Jackson, which held a special place in my heart from childhood road trips. Went out there twice with my family when I was a kid, again right before college, and then worked in Yellowstone for a summer during college. But then I didn't get a chance to go back for 10 years. The pandemic gave me my excuse, moved to Jackson, and then in fall 2021, first set a odd kind of out of reach goal for myself, which was skiing Grand Teton.
Okay.
And as a result of that, started doing a lot of cardio training and then technical skill development. At the time, I had no business even thinking about an objective like that. I was not that good of a skier. My cardio sucked. I had no experience with the ropes on rock, ice climbing, you name it. And so the first after winter of ski touring training, I got into some of that summer skill set development, and that's the first time I climbed Grand Teton and learned about the FKT. My first time climbing the Grand, I did in, I think, 12, 11 hours, somewhere in that ballpark, which I thought was fast. It's faster than most of the guided groups up there who did it 2 to 3 days. Then I looked at the website and saw the FKT was 2 hours, 53 minutes, and 2 seconds. And I was blown away that someone could ascend it that fast.
Hmm.
Only then did I realize that was the ascent and descent record. It's just mind blowing. It's
Yeah.
5-4 terrain. There's a ton of exposure. Uh, Most groups rope up at the top.
Hmm.
Guys will belay clients over frankly, like a lot of the route, even before you get to Owen Spalding, which is the 5-4, or a portion of it's 5-4, but a lot of it's 5-1, 5-2, 5-3, climbing up top. And then almost all parties are belayed for things like belly roll and the crawl. These super exposed but relatively easy moves where you have good handholds,
Hmm.
but your butt's hanging out over 1,000 feet of air.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was blown away when I realized that the record was as fast as it was. And, then we went on, me and Connor, he's my adventure partner on a lot of these things, to ski the Grand a few times, once in Trifecta, just a couple winter ascents otherwise. But we got connected in the meantime with Jack Tunzel, who attempted to get the FKT on Grand Teton in 2023. And then through our friendship with Michelino to go up there with him in 2024.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's the long-winded approach, but the Grand's a really special mountain for me. It's just a special experience to be able to watch someone run it that fast. Before I saw Jack run it roughly that fast, he ultimately got 3:02 in summer 2023. I didn't understand how it was possible. It's just
Yeah. Yeah. It is. You have to tell us a little bit more because in some respect it's a weird mountain because everybody knows what it looks like. Everybody knows its name, but it holds a very special place for the people that live in the area. It is their mountain. And um it is a unique, I don't know if unique is the right word, but I mean It melts out in the summer completely, mostly, right? I mean, you don't have
Mostly.
glacier travel in that sense, right?
Not for this ascent approach.
Okay.
You can get up to the summit without touching a glacier. The
Hmm.
only, I mean, there are a handful of glaciers in the Teton, so Middle Teton Glacier, a few glaciers on Mount Moran, but there are a number of routes to get up to the summit of the Grand that don't involve glacier travel.
Yeah.
So to break that down, I mean, and this is one of the most challenging um, and most iconic routes in North America for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Some who've done a lot of these records that I've spoken with have called it the most iconic,
Hmm.
in part because of aesthetics and in part because of the route itself. Um, for anybody who's rolled into Jackson Hole and into Grand Teton National Park, you go from this expansive, flat um, sagebrush series of sagebrush meadows to basically 7,000 feet of vertical relief that comes out of nowhere. You know,
Yeah.
that Teton fault line. I think if you were to draw a straight line from the valley to the top of the summit, it would probably be like a mile and a half, and 7,000 feet.
Yeah. Yeah.
The easiest route to get to the top of Grand Teton is via Owen Spalding. Um, but maybe to just break down the route from start to bottom
Yeah,
would be
please, exactly. That's what I where I was
totally,
going with that in a sense, just
totally.
because, I'm here from the Northwest. I see Mount Rainier in my backyard, and it's sort of that similarly iconic mountain, but it's such a completely different way to travel up to it and to approach an objective like that. So I think it would really help listeners who aren't from your area to sort of break down what it means to sort of tackle the Grand Teton.
Absolutely. So you start and finish at Lupine Meadows Trailhead. From Lupine Meadows Trailhead, which is, I would say, pretty much directly east of Grand Teton, maybe slightly east northeast. You follow a series of trails through pine forests. At first, going straight south, modest incline, and then turning west and navigating a series of switchbacks up the hill and then around the ridge line into Garnet Canyon.
Hmm.
Once you're entering Garnet Canyon, you start transitioning to a series of boulder fields
Hmm.
to get into what's known as Garnet Meadows. Once you get into Garnet Meadows, the whole thing just opens up. You know, you're in this beautiful alpine oasis. There's a creek that's flowing through the vegetation and then down into uh, well, underneath the boulder fields. You're actually traveling over the creek at certain points, depending on how you're navigating your way through. Everybody takes slightly different variations. Then there are a series of climbers trails, social trails. They're all unofficial. The National Park Service doesn't maintain anything after Garnet Canyon,
Hmm.
but they do occasionally, or at least officially, they do improve periodically the climbers trails that take people up the North Fork and the South Fork of Garnet Canyon. To go to Grand Teton, you would take the North Fork, a series of social and climbers trails. Uh, at I'd say maybe 25% of the way from Garnet or the opening of Garnet toward the lower saddle, you start transitioning to boulder fields.
Hmm.
It's the moraine of Middle Teton Glacier and TP Glacier. A combination of those two features historically developed that glacier field and that moraine. So that's where it starts getting techy. The trail running transitions to a lot of boulder field hopping, loose rock, um, scree, talus, all of those types of
Hmm.
features. And you go through the boulder field, a mix of boulder field and those loose trails up to fixed rope. Fixed rope is the way to get up to the lower saddle. Um, Basically a cliff. Guide services maintain a fixed rope there to make it a little easier to get up and down.
Hmm.
Um, Once you're over a fixed rope, you're on the lower saddle. And then again, it's a series of unofficial trails, climbers trails, social trails to start ascending up to the upper saddle. The upper saddle is a feature between the enclosure and Grand Teton. At this point, you've basically wrapped around the mountain and you're approaching from the south.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it's all fourth class and low fifth class climbing to get from the lower saddle to the upper saddle. And there are infinite route variations. Every athlete who's doing it comes up with their own most efficient path. I don't
Yeah.
think anybody takes exactly the same path. I think it's impossible to do so. Every time I get up there, I get a little bit lost.
Yeah.
And you try and find your best, most efficient way that avoids some of the more challenging, like mid-fit class terrain, which you could absolutely find if you were looking for it.
Especially too because the climbing isn't as difficult yet that you
Yeah.
needed sort of very direct, this is the only way to get up that legend, these are the
Oh,
only
no, no, no.
climbs, right? These are the only sort of holds you can take, right? The way
Hundred.
you think of Yosemite Valley, right? They're very clearly defined routes and everybody sort of holds on to the same grips in the end, right? But this is still loose enough defined, but still very typical, I think, for national parks where there is a certain portion that is clearly defined trail, and then as it gets into climbing, it becomes sort of more open, and everybody sort of finds their own route.
Absolutely. I mean, there aren't even climbers trails once you get to, I guess, the Black Dike is probably the feature at the start, like from where like the lower saddle starts transitioning from, I don't know, like a 15% grade to like a 25 or 30% grade.
Yeah,
At
yeah,
that point, the trail just disappears. Don't quote me on the numbers, but something in that ballpark.
sure.
Um,
And
and at
but
that point,
before you continue, I quickly
yeah,
want to interject for the listeners. You wrote this all up and have great maps and photos on your website at grizzliesandavalanches.com.
yep, that's it.
So we'll put that in the show notes, and people really who are not familiar with the terrain and kind of want to get an idea of the route and everything, they really should look at your website to kind of read along as you're kind of telling the story of how to get up there.
Totally. I mean, nothing. I can't describe it as well as a picture could just demonstrate the route.
Hmm. Hmm.
Totally. And so that stretch from the lower saddle to the upper saddle, guides will often start protecting, right, or they'll start belaying their clients. But most people solo it. Every time that I've climbed the Grand, I've soloed the entire route. That just comes down to comfort level. Uh, but the climbing itself is relatively easy. It's all if you're into bouldering, B0 and B1 moves, or if you're into climbing, it would be just low fifth class.
Yeah.
Um, and so then the really technical part of the route begins. Once you hit the upper saddle, Owen spawning begins. And that's where some of the moves that really scare people start. So belly roll, the crawl, the crack. They're again relatively easy climbing moves. You have good handholds, and in some instances good footholds, but at least one of the two. But your butt's over 1,000, 2,000 feet of exposure.
Yeah.
So if you have any fear of heights, you're roping up for that stretch.
Yeah, for sure.
Obviously, people who are going for the speed record are going up and down in nothing but trail running shoes and short shorts.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
From there, it's a series of chimneys and ledges, moving your way up the upper portion of Grand Teton to get to the summit. Pretty much, I mean, and there are again a bunch of variations that you could take to climb that route, but typically all of the speed records will take catwalk as an alternative to Owen Chimney. Owen Chimney is, I think, the one true 5-4 portion of the route. So with that variation, the route class probably drops to 5-3. But again, this stuff isn't particularly precise.
Hmm.
So catwalk to Sergeant's Chimney and then the summit, and then you have to reverse the whole thing,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And I think the craziest feat with Michelino's time was his ability to get from the summit to the lower saddle in basically 15 minutes.
Yeah, it's nuts.
It's insane. I mean, it took me the night before he ran it, I think maybe an hour and a half to get down. Granted, it was dark. I was up on the summit at sunset. Um, but as I was up there, I was thinking to myself, how the hell is he going to do this in 15 minutes? It's
Hmm.
mind-boggling.
Hmm.
One
Hmm.
misstep and you're going off the cliff.
Yeah, yeah.
On certain
When,
parts of the route, in other parts of the route, one misstep and you're taking a bad fall.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, do you know when if I show up and want to climb the Grand Teton, do I need a permit for it? Like in at Rainier, because of the glacier travel, officially you need a climber's permit above Camp Muir, above 10,000 feet.
Totally. Similarly, for mountains like Whitney, you need a permit to get up
Mhm.
there. Grants, for really any climbing in the Tetons, you don't need any day access permits.
Okay.
The only thing you need a permit for is overnight camping.
Yeah,
If you
okay.
want to go for multi-day objectives where you're not camping, you also don't need a permit.
Hmm.
And that's, I think, informed by or influenced by the fact that you have so many people out there doing multi-day objectives like the Grand Traverse, Teton Crest Trail, long runs. I guess not that that's that usually requires camping. If it's a multi-day effort for people who are running it, it's usually somewhere between like 8 hours and like 18 hours.
Yeah.
Um, but it'd be tough to manage a day access program in the Tetons, and I don't think there's been an issue with congestion so bad that the National Park Service has had to move in that direction. And I guess the one other thing I might mention, so what I describe on that route is the summer approach.
Sure, sure.
Um, and typically the route's free of snow in mid-July, but it all depends on the snow year.
Hmm. Hmm.
In some years that's later. In some years there's a lot of late thunderstorm activity that materializes as ice and snow in the upper mountains. Um, and then usually, but it all depends again on the thunderstorms. There's snow on the route again as early mid-September.
Hmm. Hmm.
But throughout the summer, there can be periods where there is snow and ice covering portions of the route as far down as the lower saddle.
Yeah.
Just a week before Michelinos FKT, there were a few inches of snow on the lower saddle.
Hmm. Hmm.
But in the summer months, when you're in mid-August, the sun angle is high enough and it gets hot enough up there for that to melt within, let's say, 4 or 5 days, depending on how much snow accumulates.
Yeah.
Whereas once you get in September, if you get any snowfall, it usually doesn't get hot enough up there for it to melt. And that's when, by the way, a lot of north-facing climbing routes start getting ruled out, unless you're
Hmm.
going to go up there with ice tools and crampons and do some mixed climbing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So there's a pretty narrow winter window for anything like.
Hmm.
And it's been, reported that Michelino decided to run this thing on Labor Day. That was really the only day you had available.
Yeah,
Because
yeah, yeah.
for an effort like this, you need to be in peak physical condition, and you need the rock mostly free of ice.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
never going to be 100% free of ice. There's always a little bit of runoff off there. It often comes on catwalk, but you need a pretty much clear of ice. And the only day that lined up this summer to do it was ironically Labor Day. For him, right? The Venn diagram of both, sufficient physical conditioning and good rock conditions up top. Um, Other times of year, if you're going up here in the winter, the most typical route to ski Grand Teton is Fort Stetner, which I've done a few times. And that's a series of couloirs in the south face. Other ski objectives, I mean, some people ski Otter Body, some people ascend Owen Spalding in the winter. In the summer, other popular routes include Exham Ridge, Petzold Ridge, north face of the Grand, or the north ridge of the Grand. So there are a lot of different routes that you
Yeah.
can climb on the Grand. Owen Spalding is the lowest centimeter. It's the easiest. It's the one that most people climb if they're um, just looking to tag the summit or if they're going for a speed record.
Yeah. Let's talk about the FKT side of it because it is somewhat of a unique route. When Buzz started or was involved in starting this whole FKT messaging board, there was an inspiration that came over from climbing, which is trying to find a way of sort of collecting iconic routes and tracking the running part of it. And some of the routes at iconic Wonderland Trail, right, is 100% runnable in that sense, right? But there are a few routes, and this is one of them where you have a well-known, well-established FKT, but the route in itself clearly takes it beyond the average trail runner's ability, because FKTs become by definition an attraction. I mean, I knew about the route, and I'm certainly not somebody who would do that kind of um, mountain travel comfortably, right? I mean, certainly not in that time, but even just by itself as an objective, people become aware of it. So it is sort of an interesting and unique one at rim to rim to rim. It's a clearly defined trail. You know exactly the objectives that you're supposed to be taking. Wonderland Trail, you have a clear defined trail, right? But there are other FKTs where you entering a terrain where the route isn't clearly defined by exact GPS coordinates, and it's more about the objective from A to B fastest and back, right? And this is one of those.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't the presidential traverse. You know, if you look at the presidential traverse on
Okay.
FKT, fastnotime.com, there's, I think, 2,000 words of description, right? Exactly where you need to be going, which summits you need to tag, what trails you should follow, etc. I think the Grand Teton page has like 200 words, right? And the only guidance on the site itself is you have to start and stop at Lupine Meadows, and implicitly you have to tag the summit.
Hmm.
And historically, all of the record holders have taken a pretty similar route, not because it's been defined as such, but because there's clearly a fastest way up and down Grand Teton.
Hmm.
It's through Garnet Canyon, following some system of trails to get up there. Then the route finding gets a little bit trickier. Everybody takes a slightly different route from Garnet Canyon up to the lower saddle. There are a lot of different style choices you can make there. What's the most efficient way through the boulder field? What's the most what's the most efficient of trails from Garnet Canyon up the moraine to the boulder field? Once you get up to the lower saddle, everybody has a slightly different, most efficient path to the summit and back based on their practice on the route.
Hmm.
Uh, Andy, I know, spent a lot of time up there. Jack, who's basically living up there for a few weeks before he went for this record in 2023. And Nick Lino's run up and down Grand Teton over 40 times,
Yeah.
figuring out what his most efficient path is to go up and down the mountain.
Hmm.
Um,
And
so
this
there's
is
really
and this
no,
is where, sorry to interrupt you, but this is
yeah,
sort of where these kind of iconic routes now become even more closely associated to climbing, right? If you're speed climbing the nose in Yosemite, then you're not going to show up and just think, oh, I've done some workouts in a boulder gym somewhere. I can do this, right? You need specific experience on that route to memorize the holds and the specific ways of going up this thing in order to actually be fast, right? We've entered with fastest known time trail routes also a time once Killian shows up, once Jim Walmsley shows up, right? That if you want to actually go for it and not just use fastest known time website as a sort of tour guide of best trails to do at some point in your life, right? Then you actually need to spend some specific time on there. You can't just show up and quickly grab it, right?
no, I don't think. I mean, I don't know. Maybe Killian could come back and do it with, but even he at this point has probably run it maybe 3 or 4 times at least. I don't think he
Mhm.
scouted it as much as everybody else has scouted it beforehand, but he's Killian, right? He can get away with that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Everybody else needs to put a lot of training on the route into it before they can reasonably have a chance at it.
Mhm.
100%. And even if you're just climbing it, you need to do a lot of research beforehand. Uh, I have a handful of friends, myself included, who've gone up there without someone else who's previously climbed the route. There's a really good Wyoming whiskey that details the upper mountain and all of the different variations. The first time I climbed it, I downloaded that guide, which was I think 99 pages in a PDF, and then I
Okay.
also had my notes of which features I was looking for at different points, right? When you get to the Black Dike, make a right to go up Chalkstone Chimney, then make a right to navigate around Eye of the Needle, and then follow the ridge line a little bit higher than you think you have to, but don't go over it, because if you go over it, you're going to go into Wall Street Couloir, and then you're on the path to Upper Exum, right? So like, or you're in, just
Mhm.
rock wall territory. You're going to have stuff coming down on you from the upper saddle. So they're like, it's a complicated route. You need to go up there and study the rock in advance to even get to the right spot, let alone find the most efficient path through it. So 100% agree with that sentiment. And then where was I? The FKT history, I guess.
Yeah, I guess that's so. Yeah,
Yeah,
I guess that's where we could go next. It's a good idea.
yeah. So I think the first speed attempt on Grand Teton was back in the 1930s. Um, this sort of thing wasn't obviously as prevalent really until the last decade.
Mhm.
So the record of speed attempts through the late 1900s is a little bit sparse, but what we do know is that Jock Glidden got the record in 1972, and then the summer of 1983 There was a bit of a battle between locals, Creighton King and Bryce Thatcher. Bryce Thatcher is the first record that shows up on fastestknowntime.com. The record he set was 3 hours and 6 minutes. That record stood for 29 years.
Mhm.
Nobody believed you could break the 3 hour mark until Killian came and ran the route in 2012, and got roughly 2 hours, 54 minutes.
Mhm.
Within 10 days, Andy Anderson showed up and raced the route in 2 hours, 53 minutes, 2 seconds, if my memory is right. And the record has stood since then. 12
Mhm.
years, multiple attempts. Nobody's been able to get down there. I actually don't know that anybody's run it in sub 3 since then. I could
Mhm.
be wrong. Not all of the record, or not everything ends up in the written record, right?
Yeah.
And then there have been, there was one mixed team record that was also included on the fastest known website. Emily and Killian ran it the day before. I think Killian ran it for men's unsupported. And then Jen also ran the route for the women's unsupported time in 2022.
Mhm.
And that's pretty much it. There haven't been all that many speed record attempts in Grand Teton compared to a lot of the other major routes. I think it's one of the few belt buckle routes that hasn't been taken down in the last decade because it's so challenging. And the times that were put up by both Killian and Andy were so stiff.
Yeah.
Um, and all of those records from Bryce Thatcher through to Jen in 2022, as of Michelino's, up on the FKT website without flex.
Yeah.
That's a really brief history of the FKT attempt, or I should say of FKTs on Grand Teton. One of the fastest times, aside from that, was by Jack last summer at 3 hours and 2 minutes, which is also insanely fast.
Yeah. Yeah. And he also spent several weeks out
Oh
there,
yeah,
like getting ready for it, right?
he showed up in early July in the Teton, started going up there scouting. We connected with them sometime toward the end of July. Uh, and then a series of thunderstorms frustrated his efforts. I think he was hoping to race in the end of July, beginning of August. But we kept getting low pressure systems roll into the Tetons, which deposited ice and snow up top. And he ultimately had to wait until I think August 16th to go up there and race Grand Teton.
Mhm.
Weeks rehearsing different portions of the route, trying to find his most efficient path, ascending through the boulder field, his most efficient path from the lower saddle up to the upper saddle, and then his most efficient path on the upper part of the route, or Owen Spalding, and then in reverse.
Yeah.
So he spent weeks rehearsing. He was living up in Togni Pass, which is where these athletes tend to spend the night if they're going for Grand Teton records. Up at Togni Pass, you can park a trailer and sleep at 9,000 feet to further
Mhm.
acclimatize, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is, I think, pretty standard practice, finding the highest point to rest and then just figuring out when you need to descend for recovery
Mhm.
and do some of your training at slightly lower elevation. This past summer, Nick Lino, who was doing the same thing, almost got chased out by the wildfires. I think at one point he did get chased out by the wildfires.
Mhm. Mhm.
We went up there to visit with him. There are also a lot of grizzly bears up there, so it's another hazard you have to be mindful of. The
Yeah.
Tetons, Montana, have now pretty significant rebounding grizzly bear populations, and they're especially dense up in Togni Pass. I think
Mhm.
a couple of times Michelino wandered out of the trailer to relieve himself, and he found himself face to face with a sow and two cubs
Mhm.
who shared
Mhm.
the spot with him.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's the FKT history. I guess we could probably get into Michelino's attempt
Yeah,
itself.
let's talk about him. So, I mean, I don't want to talk too much about him because he is not on the call, but can you give me a little bit an insight into his mind of like what attracted him to it, right? What made him think that he even can take this thing on, right? I mean, it
Yeah,
is such a beast and it requires so much dedication, right? And focus and training. And I think especially in 2024, I think well, since COVID sort of saw the height because there were no races of these FKTs, and it's since been tapering off because many of the top athletes just prefer doing races because that's where the sponsor focus is, that's where, sort of the attention is. So going after an FKT is sort of unique in today's time, especially one that is so prominent and takes so much time and dedication.
Absolutely. So from my conversations with Michelino, he moved to the Tetons around the same time I did. I think the thing that first inspired him to go after the grand record was when he was running Teton Crest Trail with a friend. Saw it and was just for it. Up until then, he was mostly trail running out in the Sierras. He's a Lake Tahoe native. Um, and just like they grabbed me when I first saw them, the Tetons grabbed him. They're
Mm-hmm.
just so stunning, right? It's I think Rainier or some of those Pacific Northwest volcanoes are the only other features in the lower 48 that are as jarring and as
Mm-hmm.
captivating as the Teton Range. This again, flat expanse and then incredibly steep vertical rise up to 7,000 feet if you're looking at the Grand Teton Summit.
Yeah.
So I think he had it in his mind from that point, but it took 4 years of training to get to a spot where he could feel confident that he could actually race it.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody, to your earlier point, just shows up to the Tetons and races to the Grand, except for Killian, right? I mean, an exception in sport. Um, and in the meantime, I mean, he spent. I mean, Michelino runs a lot of races. He's run and won the Rut 50K 3 times. He won Broken Arrow, Speedgoat 50K, Silver State 50K. So he balances between more traditional races and these FKTs. Um, but I think the Grand is the first belt buckle, like big iconic route that he's gone after. He's gotten Teton circumnavigation. He has the FKT for Teton Crest Trail, which are pretty prominent big routes, but they're not nearly as
Mm-hmm.
iconic or high profile as Grand Teton,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um, so inspired as early as 2020, has been training consistently since then and lapping the Grand. At this point, has run it 40 times. This summer, he decided was going to be his summer to go for it. He dedicated himself for the full time training, or for the first time to full time training. He's been, if my memory serves me right, running something like 30,000 vertical feet, like 50 to 60 miles a week, dedicating 25 hours to training weekly. He had an Achilles injury at the beginning of the summer that called into question whether or not this would be on the table. I know he had to transition to a lot of cross training, a lot of biking. He wasn't sure how that was going to translate into his times on some of these route segments. Once he got back to running in July, he, I think, found himself outperforming his prior self, you know, despite the fact that he'd been mostly training on a bike, which was confidence inspiring. And by mid to late July, I think he felt like he could really take it on
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and have a shot at getting the record. Um, and so he moved up to, he took his trailer up Togety Pass, started sleeping at altitude, really dedicated himself to full time training through the route, um, and started looking at weather windows.
Yeah.
He started feeling in his legs that he was ready to do it, I think, as early as probably mid August. But then you have to find the right window where you have a clear high pressure system, you have clear rock, you don't have ice and snow, and those come and go with thunderstorms throughout the course of the summer.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and it, I guess, me and Connor first, it became clear to us that he was going to go for it toward mid August. I'm currently splitting my time between Jackson and LA. And I decided to drive out toward the end of August to be part of the effort. I didn't want to miss out.
Yeah. Yeah. Was there any, and we don't have to go into the details, but was there a dedicated consideration that this wasn't just a personal project, but would also be used for storytelling, sponsor consideration in a sense that, I mean, usually athletes who are sponsored, they have requirements of, this is how many times you have to post, or this is what you have to deliver for us. Was that part of the equation, or was it solely a personal project that then also I don't know, like in what
Yeah.
way did you consider sort of how you should approach talking about this?
Yeah. So I would say like this was not part of his required deliverables for North Face or anything like that. Like to your point, a sponsored athlete has to participate in certain things and deliver sometimes photo assets, things like that. This was not by any stretch of the imagination a requirement from his sponsors.
Mm-hmm.
This was purely a personal objective. We went up there to capture some photos. And beyond that, how the content would ultimately be used, who knows, right? I mean, if he didn't get the record, there wouldn't be anything on the back end of it to begin with.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah. So this, I mean, first and foremost, this was Michelino's personal effort, a dream of his that he had in the back of his mind since 2020
Yeah.
and had
Yeah.
been working towards since then. His entire career, I think, was building up to an attempt at racing Grand Teton,
Yeah.
irrespective of any other third parties who might have been involved or ultimately posted congratulatory posts or you name it.
Yeah. Yeah, that expects also a little bit, that explains also a little bit the approach to the attempt. And this wasn't, an expedition that was scheduled and planned.
No.
This wasn't um free free solo with like, drones in the air, right? I mean, this was a personal project who by someone who fell in love with the mountain and wanted to go after an FKT.
Yeah. Yep. And it looked like conditions were finally lining up toward the beginning of September.
Hmm.
We thought they might line up as early as the last week of August. That's when we initially expected him to or I should say, once we got out there, that's when it seemed like he might have the conditions. I was actually in New York at the time, so I drove to Jackson to gear up and get ready, and then I had to fly to New York to teach a course. One of the things I do is teaching corporate finance courses. I was teaching some incoming equity research analysts how to do the basic functions of their job in Midtown. And I was scheduled to fly back on, I think, the Sunday before Labor Day. But it looked like we might get a weather break that day, and I decided to skip, unfortunately, a friend's first-year-old son's birthday party, which was a bummer, to hop on an earlier flight on Saturday and get my butt out to the Tetons to potentially gear up to be with him on Sunday when he went for it.
Hmm.
Um, Ultimately, it looked like he had one more day. There was a low pressure system that was rolling in on the third or the fourth that would make it um, less likely to get clean rock going forward. Once you get a thunderstorm in the beginning of September and some snow accumulation, that could rule out the route for the rest of the fall.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
just depends. And it had been hot in the days leading up to that. So we hoped that all of that snow that had fallen a week before he raced would be at least sufficiently melted to make it safe on the upper mountain up in Owens Spalding. So I landed in the Tetons, I think, Saturday night from New York again. And after catching my breath, doing a little car shuttle for a friend who was doing TCT Sunday morning, um, got to Lupine Meadows to go ascend Grand Teton for one last scouting mission. Everybody who's doing this usually has people up in the upper mountain scouting either the day or 2 days before they race it,
Hmm.
just to give them feedback, right? You
Hmm.
can only tell so much from the weather reports and guide reports to the extent there are any. It's nice to have some eyes on it who can give you some detailed feedback. What
Hmm.
exactly does it look like up there? Is there a lot of ice that's built up in the chimneys? Is catwalk clear? Is catwalk covered in ice? Basically the bare bones to know whether or not it's safe to go up there and run the technical part of it fast.
Yeah.
Um, so I think I left at like 2:30 p.m., which is insanely late, way later than I've ever left for the Grand. The first time I ascended it, I think I left at like midnight or 1 a.m.
Yeah.
Now these days, I'm a little bit faster. I'll maybe leave at like 9 a.m. Or 8 a.m., maybe as early as 7 a.m. if there's afternoon thunderstorm risk. There wasn't any afternoon thunderstorm risk, and I was delayed in the morning, so we left at 2 a.m. or I'm sorry, 2 p.m. And that meant I wasn't actually summiting until sunset. Um, but when I was up there, the route looked mostly good. There wasn't all that much ice on route. I reported back to Michelino and company, just like we had people reporting back to Jack when he went through this thing in 2023. And then I started descending. At that point, though, I was a little bit low blood sugar. It was dark. It took me like an hour and a half to get down to below saddle. I was moving very slow. I didn't get back to the trailhead until maybe 1 a.m.
Hmm.
Got a few hours of sleep, and then Connor was knocking on my truck. I just slept in my truck to maximize the amount of sleep I could get at I think 4:30, so that we could hike right back up.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
And then we started getting reports from Michelino by the time we got to Lower Saddle. He delayed his start time from 7:30 to 7:45 a.m. And then we were just waiting.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm,
And the
mhm.
suspense of the moment kicked in.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And like, I mean, this record is never going to be a slam dunk until you're close to the finish line.
Mhm.
So as he was getting to certain checkpoints, right, like as he was getting to belly roll, we're comparing his splits to Andy's. As he got to the summit, we were thinking about his splits versus Andy's. Did he think he could make up time in the descent, or was it going to be close?
How were you tracking him throughout this?
Oh well, we weren't.
Okay, okay,
We didn't have a live GPS or anything like
okay.
that. Basically, just when we saw him, we were
Oh,
tracking
yeah, yeah,
him.
yeah.
So
Okay.
where I was, I could see him when he got to belly roll, and I could think about that versus his target split.
Got it,
Right?
got it.
And then
Yes.
Connor was up on catwalk, so he could again compare his time to catwalk to Annie splits, right, and to Jack splits in summer prior.
Mhm.
So it's not now. It's not had a we weren't live tracking him via his Garmin or anything like that.
Yeah. No, I was just curious because
Yeah,
it is such a fairly short route and you're such a short it's such a incredibly fast time, right? And there's so many variables that in order to sort of determine halfway through that he is on the right he's on track, right? You have to have that mapped out pretty well. And stuff in order to have an understanding of like, okay, how much time can you spend going uphill or through that section or whatever, right?
totally. And yeah, to your point, he made it to the summit in an hour and 52 minutes. You know,
Hmm.
which is not on me. He's just cruising out the terrain. But it's still a nail biter. At that point, I
Yeah.
think he was a minute behind Andy's time. Um, and at the finish, he was ultimately a little over 2 minutes ahead of Andy.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
maybe 2 minutes and 12 seconds or something like that.
Yeah.
Um,
So for listeners, to quickly interject, for listeners, you linked to Michelino's Strava post as well on your blog. We'll link that
yep, an
too
article.
because he wrote a really long and detailed sort of report and write up. And I think that's also helpful to kind of get to understand sort of what he was thinking as he was kind of moving through the different sections and how he sort of approached this and what he was thinking or not thinking during various times in order to get himself to that time back to the trailhead, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. His Strava, I think, is the best, firsthand account of how he was thinking about things from our perspective. It was a nail biter. Even
Yeah,
when we were moving down, like Connor and I then rejoined to climb down from the upper saddle to the lower saddle. And we were going back and forth the entire way down. Does he have it? Does he not have it? We had no idea. It was hard
yeah,
to tell from the summit splits. And I guess another measuring point for just how fast he was hauling ass down, we got news that he got it when we were just clearing the lower saddle,
hmm,
right?
hmm, hmm.
Which took him 15 minutes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You had mentioned, I mean, when you're in a zone, how fast you can sort of cross these sections that otherwise take you forever is absolutely breathtaking, right?
Yeah,
It's
I mean
and
that.
there's also absolutely no room for failure, right? I mean, one wrong step and this isn't just a failed attempt.
Yeah, he's getting hurt at a minimum.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, but that's like, he's such a talented mountain runner. He didn't feel like at any point he was close to that. He
Hmm.
felt super dialed in. I think in his Strava trip report, he mentioned one small slip on Owen Spalding, the top portion of the route because of ice. And then he really locked in and dialed in.
Mm.
Just absolute tunnel vision of moving his way down that rock.
Flow state,
Um,
people call it, right?
yeah, that's it. And there were people cheering for him at the summit. I'm not sure he even heard him. I think Jack had headphones in when he was doing it. I don't think Nicolino did. Um, there were not too many parties up there compared to some of the busier days, despite it being Labor Day. We weren't surprised by that. It was such a good weather window on Saturday and Sunday. A lot of the groups that had built up behind the thunderstorm and the snow, I think, got to climb out of the way on Saturday and Sunday before the weather started rolling in. But everybody that we ran into was generally excited to be witnessing an FKT attempt.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
That's my experience on busy routes too, that as long as you as the runner don't get upset at the people on the trails, right? And you a good sport, most of the time people like seeing somebody who is doing that kind of activity. And they might under the breath to themselves say, oh, they, should be enjoying the view more or whatever. But in general, people like seeing that kind of activity on a trail. This is not something that they are offended by.
No, it's exciting. I mean, for them, it's
Yeah,
a huge adventure, right? It's their
yeah.
first big experience with mountaineering. They've got harnesses and they've got ropes, they've got puffer jackets and helmets. And then all of a sudden they see Tarzan sprint past them, and maybe
Yeah,
they're somewhat terrified by going for a historic record. I mean, that just makes your day more epic.
totally, totally.
And
I was
that's
on the
both.
mountain when, right?
Yeah, it adds to the story. It's one more thing you can go back and tell your friends, right?
Hmm.
I climbed Grand Teton, and by the way, when I did it, I was up there freezing after a night in a tent in the lower saddle, and Tarzan ran up in an hour and 52 minutes from the
Hmm.
trail,
Hmm. Hmm.
and landed the speed record for the first time in 12
Yeah.
years.
It sort of
Part of the
gives
experience.
us a glimpse of what we as humans are
Yeah,
capable of, right? And if we sort of are out there doing the same activity, we are not offended by it. We're excited for that. We're like,
yeah,
even if we take, 10 times as long, we are still sort of part of this sort of human adventuring and that, that fills us with excitement. Huh?
absolutely. I mean, it was because it took me so much longer the first time I did it that I became captivated with the speed record. The first time I
Yeah.
did it, it took me 12 hours, and I didn't think it was possible for someone to get to the summit in 2 hours and 53 minutes, let alone complete the round trip.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Right.
So let's jump ahead. So
Yep.
he finishes, the watch gets stopped, the record
Mhm.
is in the bag. I mean, obviously exhaustion, but also um relief and then excitement, right? I mean, this is
Yeah.
something that you then tell the story about, right? I mean,
Yep.
this is then something that you take and you shine a light on. You share, you're excited about it. Yeah, you want to make that public.
Yep. And so Connor and I finally got down to Lupine Meadows. I don't know, maybe an hour and a half after Michelino. And the sweetheart he is, he's still waiting there for us, just laying on the ground with a few other people who had gathered around him at the trailhead, to give us each a big hug. He
Hmm.
was just
Hmm.
elated, relieved, exhausted.
Yeah.
Arguably less exhausted than me and Connor, who had each climbed the Grand twice in the last 24 hours and had gotten maybe a couple hours of sleep between those climbs. So we're all in semi-vegetative states, but just feeling excited, grateful, and we all head over to Dornans, a couple miles down the road, or more than that, a few miles down the road, to do a cold plunge in the Snake River and have a couple beers to celebrate.
Hmm. Hmm.
While we're sitting on the bank, calls Andy Anderson, who was the prior record holder, and he congratulated him. He was fully aware of the route that Michelino took. Um, and everything's feeling good, right?
Yeah.
I think we're transition. The congratulations are pouring in. A bunch of other mountain runners are congratulating him on social media. He posted a simple post just thanking the people who helped him and were part of the journey, uh, and reflecting on a long pursuit accomplishment finally in the books. He, within the next couple days, submitted the record to fastestknowntime.com, and he drove off to California to visit with family, also to visit with Andy Anderson, who signed over the belt buckle. This
Hmm.
is one of a number of routes that has a commemorative belt buckle, created independently at fastestknowntime.com. Some of the other routes that have a belt buckle, Grand Canyon rim to rim, one of the half dome variations, Shasta, a number of others. I think it's a bit of an evolving project, so I don't know where they stopped. And then we were waiting for FKT approval.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
It seemed like a slam dunk, right? It seemed at this
yeah, at that
point.
point, nobody was expecting anything but acceptance, at least on our end.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, for sure, for sure. So, do you know then at what point? What was the first sort of moment when you realized that there was somebody who was questioning or had issues with it, or where this thing was going sideways?
Yeah, so I think it was the weekend after. I forget if it was Friday or Saturday. I think the date. I have the details more precisely in my article,
Mhm.
which will be in the link. So if I speak here, just assume that it's in the article or right. I think,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm going to be writing it when I'm speaking. But I want to say it was September 6th or 7th, somewhere around there. A few days after the weekend, essentially after his record attempt, is when he got news from the regional editor, or not news, but a question, right? Like it was reported that you took Climbers Trail that some are saying is closed. Is that true? You
Hmm.
know, and of course it's true, right? He included in his Strava report that he decided to take the old Climbers Trail. That's what's referred to
Hmm.
locally, which is a trail that skips some of the upper switchbacks on the Garnet Canyon and then Amphitheater Lake Trail. Um, that trail has been taken by, I think, 6 of 7 prior record holders on Grand Teton, including 4 of 5 of the prior men's record holders. Um, the
So he didn't invent a new route,
No,
right?
the
I
only
think that's an
person who
important piece to sort of.
Absolutely. The only person who didn't take that old climbers trail is Andy Anderson, the most recent MEMS unsupported record holder.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and on the fastest known time website, there were 5 Grand Teton records at the time of Michelino's run. 4 of them took the old climbers trail. None of them were flagged. There
Hmm.
was no mention on the site that that old climbers trail wasn't kosher. Um, Now, there was debate amongst other mountain runners as to whether or not the route should be run with that old climbers trail. I think Andy Anderson decided not to run it. So one argument would be to run the route that the most recent record holder ran.
Sure.
It's an understandable
Mhm.
argument. My leaning is whoever runs from point A to point B and tags the summit fastest should get the record, especially if the prior record holder who might have taken a different route defers to the new record holder
Yeah.
um, on their decision, right? And congratulates them in the wake of the effort with knowledge of the route they took. But
Well, especially
that's
too if
part.
the route is being talked about as a straight, this is a route from point A to point B and back, right? I mean, I think that's what I was saying sort of earlier, that fastest known time lists a couple different types of routes. One of them is a very, very clear, defined, this is how you have to run this thing, and the other one is here is the fastest known time between point A and point B, and you can sort of do your own route and you figure this out. And as this particular route crosses over from specific trail to climbing anyway, there is a big portion of it where people are making their own attempts. So it made sense that it was listed that way, and it was made sense that it was approached that way. Um, and so now people are taking offense with it, and now what? So what's your
Yeah.
sort of.
And so just to spell out some more of the drama. So I think if it was just a stylistic debate,
Yeah.
FKT would have accepted his record, especially with the blessing of the prior record holder. The issue is the National Park Service is alleging that that was a closed trail.
Hmm.
Um, and maybe just to give a little more context in the trail, although it's for listeners, the best move is probably just to look at my article and look at the pictures, right?
Hmm.
Because the picture explains this way clearer than I will. As you're coming out of Garnet Canyon, the official trail veers left to reconvene with the Amphitheater Lake Trail. That's like the Garnet Canyon Trail and the Amphitheater Lake Trail are the only 2 officially maintained trails up there, and they get a lot of traffic. Um, Now, coming out of Garnet Canyon, instead of veering left, you can also go straight and reconvene with the Amphitheater Lake Trail um, a little bit down the slope, right? It takes a slightly more direct route to reconnect with the Amphitheater Lake Trail. That trail isn't officially maintained by the Park Service. They don't have, staff up there improving it. But by all intents and purposes, it looks like a well-traveled trail.
Hmm.
And it's commonly used. As I've said, all of these prior record holders, except for one person, took that trail. And if you look at Strava, the Strava segment, there's one for this. There are at least 60 or roughly 60 other people who posted public Stravas taking the trail, going back, to when Strava became the common means to report these types of mountain runs.
Yeah, so it's
Uh,
also it is that's the other tricky thing. There are signs that say um
yeah, and
they, they
that's
don't
something.
particularly say this is trailers closed, right? The wording on the signage is a little bit
There are two signs. So and then maybe just to provide a little more legal context here, it's generally fine to go off trail in national parks, right? I mean, you want to be obeying to the extent feasible uh, the leave no trace principles.
mhm.
But the National Park Service, like in national parks, you can go off trail unless an area is specifically closed,
Yeah.
right? Most of Grand Teton alpine pursuits involve off trail travel,
Mhm.
but there's also off trail use as it extends to hunting, to fishing, wildlife photography, going through meadows to take pictures of elk and grizzly bears. There's a lot of off trail travel in national parks and in Grand Teton in particular. Um, it's not prohibited to go off trail. That
Mhm.
said, the National Park Service can close areas if they want to, and they often do for wildlife closures. There are a number of maps in the compendium, which is the collective source of all Grand Teton superintendent's regulations. There are, for instance, wildlife closures on a few summits for bighorn sheep in the winter. There are some wildlife closures where wolves are known to den. There are wildlife closures where you have intense grizzly bear activity. And those things are usually well marked.
Mhm.
The National Park Service is maintaining that this climbers trail was closed. And the only way it seems they provided public notice, which they need to do to properly close an area, are two small signs at the top and the bottom of this trail. Um, Both are, I don't know, maybe a foot wide and placed next to the trail, not in front of it. The one at the top says cutting causes erosion. The one at the bottom says closed for regrowth. Michelino only ran from the top down. He didn't run from the bottom up. So it would be the top sign that would have caused attention. And I think the general impression is this is something the National Park Service, for some reason, frowned upon, but I don't think any of us expected it to lead to criminal charges.
I mean, this is then the next level that takes this thing now also to a legal thing, which kind of makes us, as we're talking about this, a little bit careful in how we are approaching this subject, because it's one thing, to your point, if it would be a stylistical or even a local conversation where locals say, hey, we've established that you shouldn't go here, or you don't know the rules or something, right? And I mean, some of these could even be valid. I'm not saying that locals don't have a voice, right? I mean, there's definitely sort of an argument to be made that one making an important, not just important attempt. I mean, one travels to a certain place needs to understand sort of the way people treat their lands, right? To say this as the most broad. So I get that piece, right? But then the National Park Service actually gets involved in this, and that's when this whole thing sort of spins out of control. I mean, I guess we didn't even talk about the fact the way fastest known time responds, because did fastest known time respond after the National Park Service got involved, or at what point did
Yeah,
the national fastest known time flagged and also the previous records?
and that's what I was building toward.
Okay.
I think if it was just a stylistic debate, I think his time would have been accepted by fastestknowntime.com.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
they only decided to reject it after the National Park Service responded and said they were investigating and that it was
Okay.
incredibly illegal.
Okay. Okay.
Um,
Which I get from their corporate
perspective,
management. They're like, oh, we're staying out of that one, right? I
yeah,
mean,
I understand it, right? Like they
yeah.
don't want to take risks. They don't want to, go head to head with the National Park Service. I understand that. And we can get to maybe a little bit later what I think some alternative actions might be, and I laid them out in my article for both the Park Service and for fastestknowntime.com.
Yeah. Yeah.
acknowledging that, at least implicitly, they condoned use of the Old Climbers Trail historically by listing all of these other FKTs without flags, right? So after Michelino's record was rejected within a couple of days of that initial question, after only after the regional editor spoke with a ranger at I think Jenny Lake. I'm not sure exactly who they spoke to, so I won't speculate on that. And the ranger said that they were investigating, and the trail is closed. Um, and then they started flagging old records. First, they flagged Jen's time, which was accepted, by the way, as recently as 2022 with
Hmm.
the X file. Um, she took for the woman's unsupported time, she took the Old Climbers Trail. So as early as 2022, they were accepting. It just didn't draw the same attention.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
didn't prompt this conversation. And then from there, Fastest Known Time moved on to flag Killian's time and Emily's time,
Hmm.
with the mix. Former men's unsupported, latter mixed. They still haven't flagged Bryce's time. I mean, now we're getting back to the 1980s, but we have that Bryce, Creighton, and Jock also ran the Old Climbers Trail.
Hmm.
Um, if you look at some of the forums, you can also see some locals who I think more accurately represents the local opinion here. Citing that some of the reverse records also use the Old Climbers Trail, that previously guides have used it, rangers have used it, you name it. So it's not. I wouldn't say the local response to this is as critical as some of the quotes that were gathered by some of the initial reporters.
Hmm.
I think
Hmm.
the public response to this is more akin to that was an incredibly fast time, and we're a bit surprised the narrative here has become about this trail as opposed to the time itself.
Yeah, yeah,
It all seems like it's spun a little bit out of control.
yeah.
So, yeah, continuing on the timeline, Fastest Known Time rejects the record. A bunch of news articles start coming out. Of course, at that point, Michelino stops providing quotes and speaking to the press and sitting for interviews because criminal charges are in the mix.
Hmm.
And I think a best practice when criminal charges are in the mix is to stop speaking with the media. It's
Hmm.
just have to do.
Hmm.
And we stopped speaking with the media as well. And I think, unfortunately, a handful of critical quotes kept getting collected and reported, and then re-reported by other media outlets who maybe didn't have access to any sources closer to the effort or closer to the FKT history. And the prevailing narrative became that he got caught cheating or he cut the switchback. Um, the narrative almost became that he intended to do this and then conceal it, which couldn't be further from the truth because he detailed it in his Strava report.
Yeah,
Um,
plus the GPX file these
yeah, it,
days shows exactly where you went. And it's not a tiny switchback where you can sort of, walk yourself out of and saying, oh, this is like a GPX irregularity, right? I mean,
yeah,
you,
and that's the other thing. The narrative became he cut at least one switchback. When I think cut a switchback, I think you're descending down a switchback. The lower switchback
Mhm.
you're ultimately going to connect to comes into view, and rather than completing it, you just run down to the lower switchback. And that's very much not what he did. What he did is he took an old trail that's not an official trail that is hard packed, well traveled. I wouldn't think leads to the same erosion concerns that cutting the switchback brings up or brings to mind. And
Yeah.
then I think maybe another helpful data point is in terms of thinking about the National Park Services side of things, the Delta Lake Trail, unofficial trail, is within a mile of this Old Climbers Trail. I'd say tens of thousands of people go to Delta Lake each summer at least. It feels like half of Instagram is up there. It's one of the most picturesque spots in the Tetons. And that involves a series of unofficial social and climbers trails that meander through the forest to get up to Delta Lake. The National Park Service has not closed that area. In fact, they have a sign in front of it that explicitly warns this is not a maintained trail. Um, Proceed at your own, risk.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just tough to understand what the erosion and vegetation concerns are with respect to the Old Climbers Trail if they don't apply to Delta Lake. And I
Yeah.
think that's the other thing that confuses locals. When I've mentioned what the core of this controversy is, one of the first things the local will say is, well, what about Delta Lake?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
including someone who, is pretty like, who is involved in the fastest known time team and is also local. Their first response when I was explaining the situation to them is, well, what about Delta Lake? I don't
Mhm.
understand.
I mean, I mentioned it to you before we hit record. I mean, my experience in talking to public land managers is that some trails are being, there are obviously lots of different reasons of why a trail is being closed. And I think the most important thing we need to say beforehand, it is a trail that is being closed. I think it would be a different conversation if he would have just ran through some fragile meadows, right? At random, right? It's not, there is an existing trail that has been used. I think that's an important piece. But there are multiple reasons why public land managers close trails. One of them is, as you mentioned before, wildlife situations, breeding grounds, or so temporary closures. The others is that there was a serious erosion, meaning there was a landslide or something, and that trail has become unsafe or something. But to the way it looks to me, and I'm leaning myself out a little bit, but because I've heard this narrative before from land managers, is they don't want to maintain too many trail miles because that costs there's a lot of labor hours involved. And if there are multiple obvious trails to a specific route, it's easier for them to close most of them and just have one maintained. And from looking at the Strava and looking at the GPX files and looking at sort of your listening to your sort of explaining of the area and not having been there and not having been on that route, right? But my feeling is that almost seems like to be one of those reasons where they basically decided, well, there are two trails that lead to exactly the same spot. Why do we need to maintain two? Let's just only maintain one and close one off, right? That feels like a reasonable reason for it, but um yeah, that's still, to me
Yeah,
doesn't quite
and then
justify.
once you get above Barnett Canyon, it's all unofficial social trails on some very heavily trafficked
No,
routes.
no,
But yeah,
it's
so totally. And then listen, and I don't. At the end of the day, it is up to the National Park Service. I think they have certain requirements, right? And you look in the regulations, you see them. There's clear as day. If they're going to close any area, they have to provide a written determination and explain why there wasn't a less extreme measure available to them. I haven't seen that. It'd be interesting to see it if it exists. They also have to provide sufficient public notice. And where I guess I get a little bit tripped up here is, why is your first action past two small, somewhat ambiguous signs pressing criminal charges,
mm,
as opposed to putting a log in front of the trail? That doesn't take much more than a half hour of labor time. Putting a clear sign in front of the trail that says "closed, do not pass,"
yeah.
unambiguous.
See,
Putting
in
this
the
closure
Pacific.
on a map, on a newsletter, issuing a public statement. There are so many simple, cost-effective actions available, short of filing criminal charges and then going out to newspapers and saying the maximum penalty is $5,000 and 6 months in jail.
Yeah, yeah. It feels, I mean, if it's per their rule book, that is something that they can do, then that's what they're gonna say. And if it's, then they can do that. But it feels from the outside, it feels a complete unreasonable punishment for what the crime was committed, if you will, right? I mean, if we say, okay, somebody broke the law, here are the reasons for it, and there would have been different ways of going about it. In my maybe, but I'm still sort of tripped up a little bit. And again, I'm coming from very far away in all of this, even from a European mindset where we don't have wilderness areas as much. And we also close trails to tell people not to just trample over wild, fragile meadows. So it's not like that. But my understanding comes a little bit from a different angle. But seeing the photos off the trail that you've posted, I've seen lots of trails being closed where there is specific underbrush and being thrown onto the trail. So as you come around and you see what used to be a trail, right? Even if it was just a boot path, right? That there's active action being taken, not just with a sign, but actually with lots of debris on the trail that says, "Hey, we're going to make it really uncomfortable." When this looks like there are two trails and one of them has a sign that says, "Hey, maybe you shouldn't take that one."
Yeah.
That's the way it looks to me.
And, and on top of that, that a number of locals who've been part of the mountaineering scene for a while have taken that trail historically with tacit approval from rangers or
Yeah.
knowledge of rangers, and rangers never pursued them. So there was enough to, I think, introduce an ambiguity and a gray area here. Um,
Yeah.
I think based on, I think, evidence enough of the fact that Michelino didn't expect a legal issue is the fact that he openly talked about all of this in the Strava report.
Certainly wasn't hiding it. Absolutely. Right.
Someone
I
who
mean,
expects that, like, if someone who expected or understood the trail to be formally closed and to be facing penalties in the event of taking it, I don't think would be publicly discussing it in a Strava race report.
mhm.
What he expected was a stylistic debate, and I think there are multiple ways you can come out there. Where I ultimately got tipped over to the FKT should accept his record, it was Andy congratulating him and signing over the belt buckle with knowledge of him taking the climbers trail.
Yeah.
Um, so if you have 6 out of 7 prior records taking that climbers trail, and the most recent record holder deferring to your decision, that to me tipped it over to the FKT should really accept his record column.
Mm.
Um, Again, I understand once you layer in the legal challenge, they're hesitant to do so. I think a more reasonable solution to this whole thing, looping in the National Park Service fastest known time in Michelino, could be something like splitting the route into an old route that historically has been accepted and condoned, right? That would end at Michelito's time, include the old Climbers Trail, and then a new route that only has Andy Anderson on it, since he's the only person who hasn't taken the old Climbers Trail, and an understanding that the FKT community is only going to follow that route going forward.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Exactly.
and
You
then the
could make
National
that
Park
very
Service,
explicit. Exactly.
yeah, the National Park Service would pair it with explicit signage, right?
Mm.
Replace the ambiguous "cutting causes erosion" tiny sign next to what appears to be a well-maintained trail with a big sign in front of the trail, and maybe even a log that says "trail closed, do not follow," or some
Yeah.
similar which like that. I think those would be very easy from the National Park Service's perspective. I think it's more cost effective than pursuing, legal action and going to the courts. And I think that would be fair from FKT's perspective, given they presented all of these records as being kosher beforehand, and at least the history of FKTs on Grand Teton supported using that old climbers trail. It's very much in the style of that old route that the locals used to take.
Hmm.
Um, and that's ultimately where I land at the end of my article. Again, I think that article lays it out as coherently as I, can, and probably more coherently than I laid it out in this interview. I think that's probably the most reasonable solution. Another mountain runner crunched the numbers and suggested a time penalty that would have still given Michelino the FKT
Yeah.
had he followed the full route. So even if he followed the full route, I think he would have gotten the FKT by a good margin. But that's probably more complicated than what the regional editors would be interested in pursuing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, ultimately, for them, their hands are tied now because of the legal involvement by the National Park Services. They will refer to, um, we will only accept or consider anything that goes by what land managers sort of lay out, right? And if land managers say that was not okay, then they will have an easy way of cleaning their hands on it. Do you know if the National Park Services reached out to Michelino, or did they just serve him with a notice to show up in court?
I don't know all the details. I mean, as I
Okay.
understand it, he now has a violation notice, as has been reported, and he's got a court date has also been reported, or I guess an initial appearance
Yeah.
later this month on the 19th.
Yeah.
We'll see what transpires from that.
I mean, I personally find this to be a very shocking turn of events in that regard, right? I mean, I understand that the National Park Services are a giant, federal agency, and one shouldn't mess with them. I don't know if that's the right word for it,
It's,
right? But I mean, in some respect, in general, we, and this, I also mentioned this in our like pre-chat here. It's like this wasn't something that resulted in um, a rescue helicopter having to come out, right? I mean, there was no safety issue involved, right? I mean, there is no like, we need to really clamp down on this because of the resources that were being wasted or abused or something like that. There's so many ways of how this could have been worse, if you will, right? That I feel like this approach feels so unprecedented.
yeah, I agree. And I think there, again, through back channels, I think there are a number of rangers within Grand Teton National Park who would agree with what you just said.
Hmm.
Um, Bit surprised by the heavy-handed response, and hey, I still think there's time, and I'm hopeful. I'd love to see some type of a maybe civil compromise in
Yeah.
the continued pursuit of these legal actions that potentially, paves the way for FKT splitting the route, putting Michelino's time on the old routes, a very clear statement that future records cannot take the old climbers trail, and then clear, unambiguous signage. I think all of that would be pretty easy, cost effective, and reasonable in light of the fact that Michelino waded into a gray area here. It
Hmm.
was black and white before he ran the race, and he followed precedent. He
Yeah.
followed the route of almost everybody before him, with the exception of Andy Anderson. So he's very much within the traditional local style, with the exception of the most recent person to race this route.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
most recent man to race this route, because a record on the women's unsupported side was accepted with the old Climbers Trail as recently as 2022.
Yeah. Yeah. Ugh. 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 I
So it's
mean,
unfortunate, but I'm still hoping that it all resolves itself in a less punitive, more reasonable way. But
yeah.
time will tell. In the
Yeah.
meantime, I wanted to post that article and then speak to you to get a more balanced narrative out, and correct some of the incomplete or incorrect facts that keep getting recycled through the inevitable game of telephone that happens when media starts reporting on things with
Yeah.
limited information and a handful of critical quotes.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I appreciate you reaching out, and I very much sort of enjoyed this conversation as much as it was hard for me just because I don't know the area that well, right? And there was a lot of education that you brought to all of this, which I think is helpful in that regard, because our world is global now, and we have communication and information streams everywhere, and so it's so easy to make pass judgment and to find a way of coming up with this conclusion to this for themselves and projecting this out then without actually knowing what is actually happening on the ground, right? I mean, it does it does leave, uh, I don't know, it does leave a very sort of worrisome, I don't know, taste in people's mouth as they're attempting to adventure out in national parks, right? I mean, if that is sort of the way they're operating now, then I don't know, I don't know, it just feels
And I'm just hoping this is an exception of
overblown.
circumstance.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel consistent with my experience with the National Park Service. And I guess I didn't really get into this in the beginning either, but I generally have nothing but respect for them as an agency. Um, I have been to, I don't know, probably 30 national parks in my life. The inspiration of move out to Jackson was driven by a love for national parks, specifically Yellowstone. And then as time has gone on and I've gotten more into mountaineering, I think Grand Teton has probably taken my heart away from Yellowstone, which was initially my favorite national park. Um, but they're, dealing with an increasingly crowded national park system. Generally not, I think, in the areas that Michelino or the FKTs would have issues, right? Like Michelino is going up into the Alpine, that's generally a little bit less congested than the
Hmm.
local areas of the park. I think Something like Delta Lake is a particular challenge. You have tens of thousands of people who have, no experience in this type of terrain, heading up there and going off trail and, getting into trouble. Generally, like all having a good experience and not having issues, but occasionally you have to go up there and bring someone down who's having medical issues or whatnot.
Yeah.
So I know that's a strain on their resources. A big strain on their resources, people who are getting into technical terrain who shouldn't be there.
Hmm.
Teton's a great example in the Tetons. It's infamous. It is if you're at Lupine Meadows and you're staring directly east, it's the summit right next to you. You can't even see the Grand behind it. It's, I think, roughly 5,000 feet of vert and almost straight uphill.
Yeah.
Up until recently, all trails listed it as a strenuous hike, and it's really low fifth class climbing. And I think almost every summer that I've been out there, there's been a shortfall evacuation off of Teton,
Mm. Yeah.
more so than Grand Teton, and that's driven by people just getting in over their heads and putting themselves in terrain they're not comfortable. So if I'm the National Park Service, that's something that I'm also concerned about. And I think the climbing rangers do a lot of great and dangerous work to bring those people home safely where they can. Sometimes they unfortunately can't, but more often than not, they're able to rescue people and get them the medical attention they need.
Yeah.
So I think the climbing rangers do a great job. The interpretive rangers do a great job. I've only had positive in-person experiences with the law enforcement rangers. Um, this all feels like a bit of an exception to the rule.
I think this is, yeah, this is a good way of putting it. Exactly, right? I mean, this is not passing judgment and saying the National Park Service fucked up here or whatever, right?
Yeah.
This is really sort of in bewilderment. It's like this seemingly comes out of nowhere. This is, yeah,
It
it's
just seems
puzzling, right?
inconsistent.
Yeah.
And again, I've had, aside from this, only positive interactions with the
Yeah.
park.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I go in there and get feedback before doing some mountaineering attempts, right? Before I went, or before we were gearing up to do the Grand Traverse, we went into the climbing rangers station to get an overnight permit. You only need those again if you're camping, not for day access. And we got some data on the conditions.
Yeah. Mhm.
I know they work closely with the Avalanche Center, for winter reporting. There's a lot of really good stuff that comes out of the National Park
Yeah, for
Service,
sure.
local search and rescue, the nonprofit guys who go up there and rescue people, especially in the winter when the Park Service tends to stand down, um, and local avalanche centers and all of the other nonprofit uh, uh, volunteers who contribute their time to making sure the parks are a safe place for us to recreate. So this is, by no stretch of the imagination, me hating on the Park Service. I just
Yeah.
don't understand this action when there were much less extreme alternatives available.
Mhm.
And I hope we can still get to a point where one of those is pursued.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
In the
Well,
meantime, Michelino's waiting for his court date, unfortunately.
yeah, I mean, who would have thought on his end, right? He would have never thought that I would have blown into any of this. And that makes it also much more puzzling, right? I mean, if to your point, right? If he would have tried to hide something, if he would have obviously done something that would have been sort of, clearly a violation, right? Then he would have sort of been almost waiting for it in some respects, but it came so out of nowhere, right? That
We
we're
were.
just sort of sitting here now and waiting for this to unfold. And to your point, I think it's important to keep telling the narrative, keep filling in the blanks, and not just let sort of the social media noise sort of carry this, right? Because yeah, I mean, Michelina has to wake up in the morning and still look in the mirror, right? I mean, it's not like this wasn't like the crime of the century.
No, and I mean it's just the press narrative I know is weighing on him. He's a bit tired of being, it's I'm sure been draining. And to your point, unexpected. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
But I mean, back to the original, uh, or the earlier part of our conversation, is one hell of a record. 2 hours, 50 minutes, and 50 seconds.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mind-boggling, and I feel so privileged as someone for whom Grand Teton's a really special mountain to have been up there and witnessed it.
Yeah.
And for those of you out there who have seen people going for technical FKTs like this, it's just mind-boggling what someone like Michelina was able to do in really technical terrain that I have to move through 5 times slower.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and
Amazing.
so that's where I'd probably leave it. It was a really impressive mountaineering feat. Was privileged to have been a witness to it, and I hope that that becomes the narrative around it, as opposed to some controversy around cutting a switchback,
Yeah.
which isn't how I would characterize the old climbers trail.
Yeah. No, fantastic. Alex, thank you so much for bringing so much insight and backstory and sort of coloring in what we sort of have heard and read in the headlines. But I think it was super important to sort of get the full story. I really, really appreciate your time and your effort you put into kind of writing this all up, which was, I think, a good sort of outline, and I'm gonna bring that up for people who want to dive in, really to go to your website and to check that out and kind of look at the route and stuff. Of course, it's nothing than being there, but at least it gives you a little bit more insight of what the terrain looks like, what the route was, and stuff. So, yes.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for having me on. And as you pointed out, my article is going to explain it even more clearly than I did here. So go give it a quick read if you have the time.